Hello, everybody. My name is Rio. I'm the lead director of the humanities department here at Hamilton Education. So you may know me from tutoring, you may know me from other test review videos, maybe from a class you've been in or a college apps program you've run through. But either way, whether you've done a couple of things here at Hamilton or a whole bunch, if you've done any of the reading, writing side of things, you've worked with me in some way, shape, or form, even if you don't know it yet. Okay, so even with a different tutor, the stuff you've been working on has been a little bit influenced by me. So today we are going to go through all of ACT test 498 on the reading section. Okay, so we're going to go through the whole reading section of ACT 498. If you're watching this, you may have watched me go through the English section of 498 already. So we're going to go first over the passages as a whole. So I'm going to go through everything that makes the passage tricky, everything that makes the passage interesting, everything we might want to know in order to navigate that reading passage. Then I'm going to go through each and every question, talk about why the correct answers are correct, talk about why the distractors, or what we would call wrong answer choices, are incorrect, and try to teach you something about the ACT and SAT, both tests in general, as we move through that whole thing. So let's begin that process now. We'll start by talking about passage one as a whole. Thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to going through these questions for you. All right, so our first passage is an interesting thing. We don't see this all the time. We have paired passages in the literature section. So a lot of times we see paired passages somewhere other than literary narrative. Remember, every ACT is really going to start with literature. Now, a lot of times we see those paired passage outside of the literature genre, but we do see it here. So both of these passages ultimately talk about uh, mothers, all right? Mothers and their children. Okay, so we have two daughters talking about their mother. Our first comes from a Native woman, seemingly, who comes from Standing Rock, Dakota member, a Dakota Nation member, sounds like. Um, as a young girl, her mother moved to the city of Chicago. Okay, so um, we know that these are facts that are recited at first by our narrator. So again, when we say she left the reservation at 16 years old, when we hear that, we imagine someone who's very young, right? If you're watching this video, you might be about 16 years old. Moving out on your own right now probably sounds pretty daunting and scary. However, to our narrator, that sounds pretty old, right? Because our narrator is so young. Okay. So her mother goes to Standing Rock leaves Standing Rock and moves to Chicago, all crazy, getting into there. In the narrator's books, her mom is huge, impressive, as tall as a size skyscraper. What does her mom do? Okay. Um, Her mom talks politics and attends sit-ins and says what's on her mind. Takes along her daughter as a shadow and witness, right? Her mom shows her all of the things in Chicago, right, on foot or on buses or what have you, and takes her to the Art Institute. Um, Looking at a Picasso, she says this is during her blue period. The mom talks a little bit about the blue period, about why Picasso was blue, what his thoughts were. Um, Now, ultimately, are these real anecdotes? Are these real things that we would find somewhere? Not necessarily, but our narrator really trusts her mother because her mother knows things, right? Her mother's legit. Okay. Awesome first passage, really good. Second passage, in my opinion, not quite as good. Definitely like a lamer story. But whatever. Okay. So Leslie Chang talks a little bit about her parents and where they come from, particularly her mother. She has this particular yearning for water because water belongs to everyone and to no one. Wow, Leslie, that's really deep. Um, so Her parents come from different parts of China. Her father comes from the birthplace of the Chinese Republic. And then her mother comes from Inner Mongolia, a land of desert and grassy plains. Yet, despite that, the daughter is interested in water, very much like her mother. Um, so her mother always wanted to like look at the ocean. Okay, now what does this mean exactly? Well, maybe it's because her mom is kind of like the water. Okay, when I gaze out, I see her, right? Here's all this stuff. Oop. Um, Looking out at the water, her mom sees herself, right? Because she is like water. Like water, she slips between her daughter's fingers. She drinks from her mom. Um, when she's here, I wish she would leave. When she is gone, I wish she would return. She is a force as elemental as the ebbing tide, and Leslie is a child on the shore. Here's a really good line, actually. I remain a child on the shore, eagerly collecting the sea glass and the driftwood that she has left behind. That's really beautiful. Okay, really good there. But, her mom, okay, really interested in water, just which is exactly how Leslie is. So, ultimately, to kind of synthesize these two passages, they both talk about a daughter trying to make sense of their mother, respectively, each of their mothers, respectively. On the one hand, we have a much younger narrator in passage A, kind of looking up to her mom. And then in passage B, we get a little bit more of a complicated relationship between the daughter and the mother, which sees an older, grown up daughter looking to her mother and seeing her as something of, uh, uh, or something like water, to use a metaphor. So, with that, let's get into the questions themselves. So, question one is a detail question. We are asked, it's pretty straightforward here. In passage A, the narrator directly compares her mother to something. All right, so this direct comparison is the most important part of this question stem. We want to look to this direct comparison. Now, of course, the narrator does talk about a Picasso painting, does talk about being a shadow and a witness, does talk about seeing the story behind someone's eyes, and does talk about a skyscraper against the sun. So every one of these answer choices is somewhere in the passage. But which of them actually is featuring a comparison to your mother? Well, we see that she is so tall, a true Dakota woman, she rises against the sun like a skyscraper. When I draw her in my notebook, she takes up the whole page. So she rises against the sun like a skyscraper is actually a direct comparison, whereas all these other ones are not direct comparisons, right? The shadow and the witness is what the narrator thinks of as herself. The Picasso painting isn't a direct comparison to her mother, though it might be a little bit of an implied metaphor. And then finally, the story behind someone's eyes is referring to instead um, just kind of like what we see in people when talking to them. So that's how we get to D for question one, a detailed question that's a little bit straightforward. I'm assuming if you missed this, you just chose an answer choice that is in the passage, but doesn't feature, most importantly, a direct comparison between her mother and the thing that is being compared, in this case, a skyscraper against the sun. Question two asks us another, well, it's not exactly a detailed question. This is more of an inference question. So we are asked, the narrator most strongly suggests that the reason she began to believe Chicago belongs to her is something. Okay, so we have to understand the context of this passage as a whole in order to answer question two correctly. We have to understand that this whole passage A sets up this really strong bond between our narrator, who is seemingly a young girl, and her mother, right, who left the Standing Rock Reservation. Their bond is very strong, and her mother is an incredibly guiding presence. All right. So when we see it here, um, in this, we see, I grew up believing that Chicago belongs to me. She says specifically because it was given to me by my mother. So that is an important aspect here. Which of our answer choices have anything that directly says that her mother is kind of like the source of this heritage? Only D. All right. This moving like a small shadow thing is something that we keep seeing as a recycled language red herring distractor, right? Even though it is said in the passage, it doesn't answer either the first two questions. Her mother directly influencing the politics of the city is taking a thing that's kind of mentioned in there, that she talks politics, and stretching it much too far. And then she isn't taking these routes on her own. Ultimately, she's doing them with her mother. So D is the only one that kind of shows that dynamic between our narrator and her mother like we want it to. Three is, in my opinion, probably the hardest question on this passage. It is very tricky because there's a distractor in here that's really good, though it isn't correct. So it can most reasonably be inferred from passage A that the narrator doesn't bother to verify her mother's ideas about Picasso and his work because the narrator something. So I underlined this already or highlighted this already. I like my mother's version best, right? She doesn't bother to check the references about these anecdotes about why Picasso was blue because she quote unquote likes her mother's version best. So that direct quote there is what leads us to C, right? She likes what her mother says about the artist. This is just a simple liking. Okay. It isn't that she directly believes her mother, and in fact, it's suggested that um, if she did go into these things, they wouldn't be there. They wouldn't be in those references because they're not in those references. They don't exist, right? Um, so it's not that checking references would be a waste of time. It's that, you know, they're not going to be there anyways. Ultimately, she just likes what her mom says. All right, so getting rid of B is difficult, but there's something so good in C. This likes what her mother says about the artist that is directly attested to in the passage. So when we're asked to infer something from a passage, I want us inferring from the details, right? I want us finding something that is actually directly stated in the passage and using that as our guiding principle, our lodestone, if we want to use kind of an analogy that we might see on the SAT or ACT. We want to use that as the thing that brings us directly to our inference. Let the text bring you directly to the inference, right? These other ones are more off base. It's not that she doesn't know what references to do. She just thinks that no references are going to match what she gets from her mom, which is she likes so much. Then finally, it isn't her own ideas about the artist that is so important to our narrator, but rather her mother's ideas about the artist. So that's why we can get rid of D because it focuses too much on our narrator's idea rather than her mother's idea. So that's how we arrive to C for question 3. A really tricky question. If you missed this, make sure you are double checking that what you are inferring is attested to somewhere in the passage. Okay, so question 4, if you missed this, I'm worried you may have fallen for a baggage distractor. You might have used some examples from your own life in which you might be asked a similar question like our narrator, where's your family from? Where are you from? And think that it's not really all that interesting or important or insightful of a question. Okay, or the answer to that question isn't very insightful. So our narrator basically says the answer to the question that is immediately asked of her probably doesn't actually reveal anything significant. What is that directly? Well, let's look at it in the passage. I'll underline it in blue. Okay. Westerners ask me where my parents were born, as though the answer will enable them to glean some knowledge. But this response signifies nothing. Okay, so which response signifies nothing? The one that answers the question of where were your parents born? How do we know that? It's directly attested to in the passage. How do we know we want something that's directly attested to in the passage? Because we have a detailed question as signified by this in passage B at the beginning of 4. I think the hardest distractor to get rid of here is B, because she actually likes this idea, this question of where did your ancestors live? That's what she would rather answer as opposed to where your parents from. So that I think is somehow makes that the hardest one to get rid of. A and D don't aren't explicitly referred to in the text. Remember, detailed question for 4. Let's just go ahead and find it in the passage itself. Question 5, we have a word and context question. So we're looking at 2 words here, actually, the word blinding and the word overwhelm. So we want to look at these in context and try to make sense of why the author is choosing these words in particular, right? The view is brilliant and blinding and overwhelming, right? So really we want an answer choice that refers to how extreme these adjectives are or verbs are, and we really want to uh, you find an answer choice that demonstrates that these things are overcoming someone. They're inspiring a lot of feelings. So, quietness is certainly not right. Okay, blinding and overwhelming are not quiet. We don't know whether they're quiet or whether they're loud, right? We just know that blinding and overwhelming both seem to take over our viewer. They're very extreme emotions, okay, or extreme uh, senses or sensory experiences. Fright is maybe the answer choice you chose if you missed this, but is there anything that directly relates to fright or being scared in a blinding or overwhelming situation? Not directly in this passage, okay? The bigger thing that's shown here is just how much it is, how extreme, how awe-inspiring it is, okay? A feeling of awe doesn't mean just simply awesome, that's cool, right? Awe doesn't mean exclusively like positive things. It just means something that is almost beyond our comprehension, right? So that's how we arrive to B for 5, because blinding and overwhelming sensory experiences are something that maybe go beyond what we would typically expect to experience, which very well aligns with the definition of the word awe. Question 6, I kind of disparage this passage written by Leslie, Leslie Chang. No offense to her, but I think it's very overwrought, kind of an embarrassingly written passage. But we have a really nice sentence here at the end. I gotta give it to her. This last sentence is a beautiful sentence. That's what we're asked about in question 6. I remain a child on the shore, eagerly collecting the sea glass and driftwood she has left behind. Now, we cannot read this literally, okay? She's saying all before this that her mother is water. Her mother is like water. Whoa, deep. Okay, pulling away and then coming back in with the force of like an element. All right. Again, no comment on, what I think about the metaphor of her mom being like water, but extending that metaphor, we now see our narrator embodied within the extended metaphor, right? If her mother is like water, then she, the narrator, is like a child on the shore, watching the sea come up and come back, right? And what does the sea do as it comes in as a tide and leaves as a tide? Well, it leaves certain things behind. In this case, sea glass and driftwood. So, what we have here then is a continuation of a metaphor. So metaphor in A is good, right? For the narrator's feelings or the narrator's experience as her mother retreats, as the tide pulls out to, continue to use the extended metaphor. Ultimately, she goes around collecting the things that her mother has left behind when her mother pulls away from land and pulls away from the narrator, the daughter itself. Okay. Really pretty nice. Really, really, really good right there, at least. Is this a memory directly? No, this is all a metaphor, right? Again, her mother is not actually water. Okay, this isn't some kind of like Moana thing or whatever, or something. I don't even know, right? Her mother is not actually water. If you read that and believed that, you got to remember literature does this sort of, metaphorical thing sometimes. All right, so this isn't a memory of her childhood where her mother is pulling away as a body of water and leaves behind some driftwood and sea glass for her. That would be absurd. Okay. Again, C, again, says that this is a literal explanation, to which I repeat, her mother is not water, right? She's saying her mother is like water, which is, again, maybe overused, but is certainly a metaphor. All right. And then finally, a reference to a set of objects that the narrator as a child often found on the shore. How would we know that for sure? Okay. D is one of those classic answer choices or distractors we see on the ACT and SAT that could be true, could be plausible, but it doesn't really answer the question, right? It's not a guarantee. There's nothing wrong with an answer choice like A for question 6, but there is something unsure about an answer choice like D. So we know that this sentence continues the metaphor of our narrator's mother being like water and pulling away from our narrator and leaving things behind for our narrator to be like a child collecting on the seashore. That's why we have A for question 6 in what is the best sentence of this passage, B. So 7, like 8 and 9, starts to synthesize our two passages. So we're synthesizing passage A and passage B here. We have to see something that is directly referred to in both. So for 7, which of the following actions do narrators of both passages closely connect with their mothers? So as we go through this, I would suggest, rather than looking for what you think is right first, I'd rather you look for what you can eliminate. So for example, why can we eliminate B? Does passage B talk at all about Chicago streets, exploring Chicago streets? No. So B is in passage A, but not passage B. Let's look at C, speaking openly and boldly. Do we learn at all about how the mother in passage B talks or leads things? No, no direct reference to any of that. Finally, D, staying at hotels and cities. So we know that our passage B stays in a hotel, all here, staying in a really swanky hotel, seemingly. All right. Passage A, is there anywhere that suggests she's staying in a hotel directly when she's in Chicago? No. Now, we might kind of assume that when she left suddenly for Chicago to get a job, maybe she could have got a hotel at some point. But is it directly referred to in passage A? Is it something we know for sure? No. All right. Finally, so we've gotten rid of B, C, and D. Let's talk about why A is correct. What traveling and moving do both of them do? So passage A, we know that she traveled from her reservation on Standing Rock to the city of Chicago. So we definitely have traveling. Then she's moving around a lot too, right? She's moving and going from one end of the city to another on foot, on bus. She walks around. She goes to sit-ins. She talks politics. She's moving, right? In another sort of sense, we see this as well in passage B, right? Her mother is something of a quote unquote metaphor, or sorry, a nomad, right? Now, this nomad thing is yet another, certainly not overused metaphor, right? My mom is a nomad, forever moving, changing, and going, yet always retaining some essential part of her being. Okay. Again, whatever. Okay, Leslie. Why don't you say you're a free spirit while you're at it? Say the most generic things you possibly could, Leslie. But certainly it shows a moving thing, right? So both passages talk about mothers moving. So that is why we can go with A for question 7. Okay, so question 8, we are asking to infer something that's different between passage B and passage A. All right, so the narrator of passage B would more likely than the narrator of passage A describe her relationship with her mother as being something. Okay, so how would passage B's narrator say her relationship with her mother is different than the narrator of passage A would describe her relationship with her mother? All right, so obviously, passage A, they're cool people, right? Probably because the writer's cool. They're all together. They're having a good relationship. Passage B, even though they're staying in this, hotel with this gleaming view of the ocean and the sun and the city, like it's a hard knock life for the author of passage B. Poor Leslie. I hope you feel bad for her, right? And her really awful metaphors and over worn writing. Okay, she's a horrible writer. Um, what might we see here for poor Leslie? Well, she has some feelings of distance and tension, right? Because her mother is again like the ocean, an ocean that comes in with the tide and goes out with the tide, right? Hard, hard life. Okay. So is this something that Passage A feels? No. They're dope. They're living together. They're running around the city. Her mother's actually interesting and smart. She moves to the city of Chicago during the war in order to, as a 16-year-old, make money for her family and support her family. She's bringing her daughter around like a shadow of herself, right? Something that comes along and is, ultimately like directly connected to her, right? Passage B, instead, again, her mother is like a nomad, right? Really compelling metaphor here, Leslie. Um, so nomads move around a lot, right? There's a certain distance there. There's a tension as the tide goes in and goes out. So, with these overused trite metaphors, our narrator is trying to suggest, or writer is trying to suggest, that the narrator has feelings of distance and tension with her mother, right? Lively conversation and pure joy is restricted to the dope family in Passage A. Fierce competition and debate goes too far, especially because we don't see debate here. And then physical affection and warmth, again, is restricted to the dope family in Passage A, not something that we see in the world of narrator Passage B's sad, horrible, terrible life, in which her parents just, set him up in really nice hotels, and her mom is, like a nomad. All right, so for question 9, we're asked to synthesize something from passage A and passage B. So the narrator in both passages, regardless of which passage we're in, must share something about her mother. Okay, so um, I would say let's go through and get rid of things that aren't in both passages. So, um, do we learn about the narrator's father in passage A? No, right? All we know about is the narrator's mother, the fact that she left at age 16 to make it on her own in Chicago, all this stuff. We don't hear about the narrator's father at all in passage A. Um, Passage B, academic interests. Well, we do get something about the academic interest kind of in passage A. Um, we don't really directly see um, it totally and honestly either of these passages. Okay, so academic interest is too specific. I wouldn't say that this interest in Picasso is a full academic interest, anyways. Now, physical appearance we certainly get in passage A, right? She's tall. That's about what we get. Even though it's from the perspective of a young girl, we kind of feel like she must be telling the truth, right? Um, but we don't get the physical appearance of the mother in passage B. Again, when the narrator in passage B makes the, uh, you know, stunningly deep metaphor of saying that her mother is like water, her mother actually doesn't look like water, um, most likely. Rather, that's a, really like profound metaphor of saying her mother is kind of hard to understand, like water is hard to understand. Okay. What do we get in both of these passages, however, is personal history. So we certainly see it in passage A. The personal history of the mom is just really interesting, right? She's leaving town. She's setting things up for her daughter. She's being real cool. She's living her whole life and bringing her daughter along for all of it. Super cool, right? Passage B, on the other hand, our narrator, we get, a lamer personal history, but we still get one, right? We see that her mother is ultimately from um, either Beijing or Luoyang, right? We see that her mother's father comes from somewhere. We know a little bit about the history of her mother um, descending from an inland people who are nomads, which again leads to the lamest metaphor about her mother being a nomad. So, yeah, so they both show the personal history of their mothers. So with that, that's how we end passage one. Move on to passage two. Passage one, pretty cool. Two passages that are pretty interesting. One with a couple nice sentences, passage B, but overall pretty bad. And then passage A being really cool. Okay, you guys, so passage two here is a humanities passage. It's ultimately talking about the history of a pretty obscure element of America, that being the ice harvesting industry of the 1800s. So, um, ultimately, understanding the passage itself isn't very difficult. There isn't a really explicit main idea here. There isn't like a real argument at work. Ultimately, it's just kind of accomplishing the goal of overviewing this industry as a whole and going through it sort of chronologically. Um, I would really recommend, in order to make it through this passage and to make this passage really understandable for you, to annotate, particularly annotate structurally. So let yourself know what each of these paragraphs are doing, because to be honest, this passage is kind of boring. Not the most common thing on the ACT. A lot of times they're not the most boring passages, but this one is fairly boring. So annotating it will help you not be bored. So, um, this first paragraph, we hear about the height of the ice industry in 1879, where 8 million tons are harvested, perhaps, right? It is such an extensive thing that maybe 8 million tons is not enough. So, uh, 8 million tons are harvested, 5 million meet the consumer, and the biggest market is New York, right? Now, where does it come from? We see it being built up in Albany on the Hudson River, and all this ice getting to supply the city of New York. And that when there are these ice famines, when there isn't enough ice, they go all the way up to Maine, where we can get a top quality crop for cheaper. And they pack it in hay and sawdust and ship it to southern cities for a bunch of money. Um, now, next paragraph talks about uh, how this industry continued to grow, especially with New York. New York did not look into artificial refrigeration yet. Mainly, they built these big wooden warehouses alongside the lakes and the Kennebec River. The first crisis, then we see the next paragraph, was caused uh, not yet from artificial manufacture. So even though later on we might hear or believe, ooh, artificial manufacture is biggest, the first crisis was not from artificial manufacture, but pollution, right? So here I would write for yourself probably something along the lines of pollution, P for pollution. Once the trade really began to decline, it was because of electric power, right? So this suggests, okay, actually, what really made it decline in the early decades of the 20th century, so the 1900s, was that electric power came to replace it, right? So that's refrigeration. And as this goes on, the evidence of ice harvesting goes away. The great houses burned down, and the majority were demolished or rotted away. Finally, we see this is the evidence, the modern evidence of ice. So I would say modern here and here. So these last two paragraphs talk about what is the legacy of ice harvesting? Well, there are, you know, examples of these tools in museums. and all that. But ultimately, this once great industry, all that is really left is the fact that there is ice still every winter, and a couple of memorials to reference it. So, passage itself is pretty straightforward. Now let's go ahead and get into questions. So question 10 asks, which of the following events occurred last chronologically? So we need to know what that means, okay? Last chronologically means the most recent thing, right? The last of these events to take place. So, um, if you missed this question, I presume that you were stuck on trying to think which of these events was the last thing to take place in the ice industry portion of it, right? Whether, the cargoes of ice being sold or the price of ice or what have you. But really, the last thing to take place is the one that takes place in the modern day, which is answer choice B, right? Remember, these paragraphs here talk about our modern notions of the ice era, right? Which is these divers coming out holding uh, implements used 100 years ago. So that's how we get to B for question 10. If you missed this, you probably forgot about this modern era in the final two paragraphs of the essay. So question 11 is what we call a detail question. We have this nice thing here that says the passage states that something. Okay, so we're looking for the decade from 1869 to 1879. Okay, so 1869 to 1879. I'm going to show you where this is proven in the text. So we know that our correct answer choice is A. So where is A in the text? Okay, well, we see that Henry Hall gave an account of the great growth of the industry in the preceding 10 years. So preceding 10 years means the 10 years before something. And when did he publish his report? Or when was he commissioned? 1879. So in 1879, Henry Hall talked about how much the ice industry had grown in the previous 10 years. So that means we had significant growth in the decade before 1879, which would be 1869 to 1879. All of these other answer choices would simply be guesses from somewhere else in the passage. All right, so remember, when we're working with a detailed question like 11, we want to find the detail that actually supports this question in the passage. So make sure you've hunted that down. Okay, so question 12 is another detailed question. Though it looks like a word and context question, and officially it is a word and context question, it's really not a vocab question. We're asking, what is the metropolis referring to when we look at it when it's used up in this first paragraph? So for you, it'll be highlighted. All right, so I'll highlight it as well. We'll highlight supply the metropolis right here. Okay, so when do we supply the metropolis? Um, so, um, well, this is talking all about, I'll highlight the other part that talks about this, all about New York. Okay, so there were 135 ice houses, but even this was not enough to supply the metropolis. Trying to supply New York between New York and Albany, right? So even though Philadelphia is mentioned, the metropolis we're talking about here is only about New York, right? We are only talking about New York in this portion of the ice houses between New York and Albany. We're not talking about the average US city that isn't referred to. We are not talking specifically about Philadelphia, nor is Albany a metropolis, right? We need to know what a metropolis actually is as well. So we arrive to New York City based off of the yellow highlighted that I have shown in this portion of the passage. So that's how we arrive to B for 12. So question 13 is what we call a detail question, something we see a lot of on the ACT. So based on the passage, the 1879 Maine ice is described as something. So I am going to I'm going to highlight in this in green, the 1879 Maine ice. So where do we talk about the 1879 Maine ice? So we know uh, that in 1879, the year of this reporting, there was an ice famine. All right. Uh, that year, that year is what gives that away. What is that year referring to? 1879, right? The report written by Henry Hall. The ice was 15 to 20 inches thick in Maine. So, what do we know about that? That is a top quality crop. Okay, so we want our answer choice to say that it's of high quality, that it produced a frenzy of harvesting in Maine, and that a ton, 20,000, 2,000 cargoes of ice were shipped south to New York, Philadelphia, and other more southern cities where they were sold for a total of around $1.5 million. Okay, so all this ice was sold in New York, Philadelphia, and other more southern cities. Okay, so our answer choice that aligns with that perfectly is A. All right. Um, Not a solution isn't what we see there. Uh, Maine ice crops were not affected by the famine. That was rather the Hudson crops. And then finally, this part is not attested to in the passage. So that's how we get to A for question 13. Always look in the text itself. So question 14 asks about the fourth paragraph. I'm going to identify the fourth paragraph with this green marker. So we see our first, second, third. Here is our fourth paragraph. Okay, so paragraph 4 is right here. So what do we hear about in the fourth paragraph? Well, the ice trade began to decline, and as it declines, the evidence of its vast scale disappears. Because there was no need for these ice houses, they either burned down or demolished and rot away. So, um, all of the evidence of the natural ice trade starts to slowly disappear once the ice trade begins to decline in the early 20th century. So, A demonstrates that main idea perfectly. Was the steam train what demise of ice harvesting? No, it was more about electricity. Steam trains maybe caused some of these houses to spark up and burn down, but that's it. C. They're extremely flammable and therefore few remain. Extremely flammable is fine, but again, does it say that most burned down? No, it says the majority were rather just demolished or rotted away. So that's not why there are few remaining. And finally, D doesn't make sense. There wasn't a short-lived revival in the 1950s. Up until the 1950s, we see that certain parts of the United States still used lake ice, but there wasn't a revival or anything. So that's how we arrive to A for question 14. Always go to the text. Question 15 is yet another detail question. We have a ton of detailed questions in this passage and in the ACT in general. So we're indicating something about, excuse me, I'm going to highlight this. We are indicating something about what these manufacturer catalogs refer to. So what do they show? So let's go up and highlight this portion about the manufacturer's catalogs. So one or two museums have displays of these tools, and they have preserved catalogs that present their versions of the ice plow, the ice saw, the grapple, the jack grapple, the breaking off bar, the caulk bar, the packing chisel, and the house bar. All of these other specialist implements, the use of which have fallen into forgettedness, right? So all these tools that are important to the ice trade are no longer really understood. but they are ultimately um, showing, look, the natural ice industry had a ton of stuff that they were using. Um, and though they're not as relevant now, they were really relevant back then. So that's what we arrive to C for question 15. So 16, we are asked to identify where the author contradicts himself. Okay, so 15 kind of actually points to 16. So remember, there's a big portion of this passage that talks about all of the things that remain from the ice trade, right? What are these things? The things that are in museums. So these odd implements that were used that fell through the ice, these collectors' catalogs, things of that nature. Then in the next paragraph, the guy suddenly says, right, all that is left is the water itself. Okay. Um, no, not true, right? Not all that is left is the water itself. There still are these antiques that have remained, right? So the house is burnt down, so the houses aren't there anymore. There are other things that aren't there anymore, but all these tools, all these uh, our catalogs are relics of that old time. So uh, when he says that all that is left is the water itself, we know that is not true. Um, there are no alternatives, right, for ice houses. I would assume that you probably chose B for 16 if you missed this because you thought, well, they eventually use artificial refrigeration. But is this explicitly referred to? No, right? We have to find the specific spot where it's directly contradicted in the passage. So find actual lines in the text. Then finally, A, that's just a fact. Okay, so D is what he contradicts himself by saying there's no relics left, there's nothing remaining except for, well, actually all these tools I mentioned a couple lines ago. All right, according to the passage, okay, that means we have a detail question. Detail questions mean we're talking about something directly in the passage. The time period says, 1869 to 1879. How much was made artificially? Let's go ahead and seek this out actually in purple, right? How much was made artificially? We go up here and we see that New York did not explore the use of artificial refrigeration, and that in New York, none of its ice was manufactured artificially. It was all cut in the winter and stored in hundreds of timber warehouses. So our correct answer is to say none, right? This is not a too extreme distractor. It actually says directly in the passage that none was artificially produced. So that's how we arrive to D for question 17. Remember, we want to be cautious about extreme words, but that doesn't mean that they are always wrong. Sometimes they're right, like we have in this case. All right, so for question 18, we have yet another detail question. So we're to look for this detail in brown. So for shipping purposes, what was natural ice packed in? Well, we see it specifically referenced in the passage that they were packed in hay and sawdust, right? Ice was packed in hay and sawdust to be shipped south. So that is what directly proves our answer choice C. Some other answer choices that you may have chose are something like A, because you might have thought, oh, refrigerated box cars make a lot of sense. But remember, shipping purposes of natural ice isn't discussed after refrigeration in this passage. We're focusing really solely on what goes on in the natural ice era. So with that, we have gone through all the questions for passage 2. Let's go ahead and move on to passage 3. Okay, so now we begin on our third passage, which is our humanities passage here. I find this passage really interesting, really entertaining. You might not, but what is this passage about? So it's ultimately the art of what is called dubbing. Okay, so what is dubbing? So dubbing is when, as opposed to a subtitle, someone gives the voice of another actor who is speaking in a different language, right? So you dub over someone else's part with a new actor. So I would have annotated this passage using probably structure here. Okay, so this first paragraph, this is basically what we would call the detractors, right? These are the detractors of dubbing, people who don't quite like dubbing, right? We see dubbing compromise the intention of a director. These are all Italian directors, right? Pretty much for the most part. So Antonioni, one of the best directors ever, saw dubbing as acoustic surrogate, and it compromised the intention of the actor. Um, Pasolini, even better than Antonioni, thought that both dubbing and subtitles were evil, but that dubbing was less harmful since you could see the picture in full. Whereas Renoir from France sees dubbing as a monstrosity. So these are all detractors of dubbing. Next, though, we see Fellini, right? Maybe the best of them all. Okay, all great directors here. Fellini says, um, Fellini believes that dubbing is a part of his artistic progress, right? Or his artistic process. Um, so he sees this as something that all goes together. So Fellini, in fact, has examples, this wonderful story here, where he asks a grandmother to tell a really sad story. And while she tells that story, instead, Fellini adds a dub about war and hunger from Emilia Romagna. Okay, so some people like dubbing, some people don't in terms of directors of the films. Now we get to dubbing the act of it. Okay, this paragraph here, I would say the act of dubbing. Okay, this is basically like, what is dubbing? How does it work? Okay, we see that there's a lot of movement, a lot of expressiveness in trying to capture what's actually going on the screen. If someone is running, you're going to run too. Now we see Italy prefers dubbing to subtitles. All right. So generally speaking, Italy prefers dubbing to subtitles, according to this paragraph here. Then we get another paragraph talking about kind of an expert of dubbers. This is a dubbing director, and who basically says that, voice actors get attached to their dubbing. I don't want to say compatriots, like partner, right? So if you're doing one person all the time, they kind of get attached to that. They don't want to get moved from that. And then I would say that this paragraph here kind of builds on this paragraph to say, look, right, these voice actors try really hard to embody the voice of the actor who they are dubbing for. So this passage as a whole is basically about Italy and dubbing within Italy, which again, the definition of dubbing is provided up here. Dubbing refers to providing a film with a new soundtrack, especially dialogue in a different language. Famous example for y'all is Western movies from the 1960s and 70s were filmed using a mixture of American, Spanish, Italian, and other European actors. They all spoke kind of random their own languages, and then they dubbed over the dialogue in English for the non-English speakers. So one of those reasons why those movies actually don't have a ton of dialogue, perhaps. So as a whole, that's what the passages got going on. We'll move on to the questions next. Okay, so question 19 is asking a purpose question. So we're asked to look at this final sentence here that says Ward says he's off to have dinner with Meg Ryan before clarifying that it's not actually Meg Ryan. It's the person who dubs for Meg Ryan in Italian, right? So someone who provides Meg Ryan's voice on Italian versions of these films. So, what is it illustrating the author's central claim? Okay, almost a main idea thing. Well, the author tries to show that dubbing honestly produces a sort of mix of the person who is the dubber and the person who they are dubbing for, right? We see this here. We see this here. We see this in many places. So answer choice C lines with that perfectly. Ward doesn't dub many different actors. He is half Ward, half Jackson, right? As we see here, half Clark, half Costa, a hybrid individual, right? So again, pointing towards C. Do we know that the Ryan's dubber is as effective as Jackson's dubber? Not necessarily, nor is that the main idea of the passage. And then finally, this is sort of a baggage distractor. Do we really think that this is what the main idea of the passage is? No, but rather that dubbing kind of produces an interesting hybrid. So that's how we arrive to C for question 19. Okay, so question 20 asks, basically, looking at the passage, what can we infer about who Vairano would agree with? So where is Vairano? We see here, Vairano is a dubber and direct dubbing expert who adapts foreign films, and he is really good. So he makes things that should be undubbable, dubbable. So he certainly sees dubbing as useful, right? He does all this sort of stuff with dubbing. He really likes dubbing. So who of these answer choices likes dubbing? Well, we know that it's not Renoir. Renoir says that dubbing is a monstrosity. All right. We know it's not Pasolini because Pasolini thinks that dubbing is an evil, right? Though it's less awful than subtitles. We know it's not Antonioni because Antonioni thinks that dubbing compromises the intention of the director, leading to an artificial product that lacks artistic unity. But who would agree with Vairano? Fellini. Why? Because this whole paragraph here talks all about how Fellini loves dubbing, right? Just like Vairano does as well. So that's how we get to B for question 20. Okay, so question 21 asks, what is the function of this second paragraph, this one that's all about Fellini? If you missed this question of 21, I'd recommend you go and watch the review video for the passage as a whole. That's just a few videos previous to this one. So what does Fellini do? Well, Fellini is an example of somebody who loves dubbing. After a paragraph that talks all about how much these Italian auteur directors hate dubbing. So Fellini is the counterpoint, right? So B shows the counterpoint to the perspective that dubbing is a sin, right? He sees it as a useful, in fact, beneficial thing. Now, C says, hey, isn't this a response to criticism of Renoir? It's not a personal direct response to Renoir's criticism, nor was Renoir's criticism of Fellini's work. Okay, C is too specific. A, what is a contemporary perspective on the merits of dubbing? Well, something that's happening right now. When was Fellini making his films, according to this? 1973. So that's the wrong era. And then finally, what is the author suggesting in the first paragraph? Well, in the first paragraph, she's suggesting that a lot of directors dislike dubbing. However, Fellini's work doesn't strengthen that argument. It weakens the argument that dubbing is bad. Rather, Fellini says dubbing is good. So that's how we get to B. He is the counter perspective to paragraph 1's group of auteur directors who dislike dubbing. Okay, 22 is a question about a very crazy anecdote from Fellini. If you missed this question, I suggest you go back a few videos and watch the passage overview as a whole. Okay, so in this paragraph that talks all about Fellini, one that we have gotten a lot, there's an example of a time in which Fellini films an old lady who he asks to tell a sad story. After he films this whole expressive sad story about her grandson, Fellini instead puts over it a new voice, a new dub that talks all about war and hunger using an actor from a totally different area. Imagine you use, someone from New York to tell a story because they're very expressive, and then you have someone act over it in a Southern accent, right? Real crazy. So, why do we get this anecdote? So, is A, you know, is it true that he preferred to feature voices with northern accents? Not exactly, but also it kind of is true in the passage. He does choose this accent because he likes this northern accent. However, is this what this line serves to do for the passage as a whole? No. Okay. Remember, when we're thinking about what a line does in the context of a passage as a whole, we have to look at the passage as a whole. Okay. B, is he closely following the scripted dialogue? No, absolutely not, right? He's replacing her words entirely. C is correct because look, dubbing is an essential element of his films. He gets all of the expressiveness of her story while getting an accent that he prefers in the dialogue. So C is correct. And finally, D is absolutely incorrect. It's directly contradicted here because he doesn't give her a script. Rather, he asks for her to tell her own stories. So that's how we arrived at C for question 22. Question 23 is a two-layered question. So we ask, does Cortese agree with our passage author's assumptions about the reason for Dubber's over-the-top zest? So we need to know two things. What does our passage author think about why dubbers are over the top? And why does Cortese think that dubbers are over the top? So, why does our author think that dubbers are over the top? What's the guess? Um, well, she thinks maybe it's a consequence. Oops, I'm using the wrong thing here. Whether she thinks it's a consequence of having to focus light one's talent into the few centimeters between mouth and microphone, right? Creating a bodily rebellion to the condition. So she is in pink. What does Cortese think in green? Um, this is hardly the reason why we twitch and turn. We are used to doing all this kind of stuff. We're trying to recreate large movements in a small space. That's why we move so much. So D is the perfect explanation that lines up with that. He says, look, you're not right. Here's what I think is actually the explanation. With C, is he gruff about it? No, right? He's very gracious. And then A and B, he doesn't agree with her, so those are wrong. So that's how we arrive to D for question 23. So where does the passage talk about in question 24 Via del Corso? So we see Via del Corso, which I'll do in orange, talked about in this paragraph. So there's the Metropolitan on Via del Corso, which recently closed. Why does that matter? Well, there are only still a few options for seeking subtitled languages in Italy, and one of them just closed. Everyone else remains hooked on dubbing. So we can assume that the Metropolitan is a a subtitle preferring place. That's how we get to B, right? Why? Because we know that it's one of the few places that were doing subtitles that are now gone. We can't presume that there's any dubbing taking place here, right? We basically know that this place went out of business because they were one of the only places that used or gave subtitled language films. It went out of business because the only people going there are American and British expats and show business people, while everyone else, Italians, prefer dubs, right? They want to go to the dubs. So that's how we get to B for question 24. If you missed question 25, I really suggest you watch the video for question 24, which is the question right before this. We ask, compared to today, or compared to subtitled films, dubbed films are what? So we see that dubbed films are much more popular, right? Italians remain hooked on dubbing, right? Um, Looking for a subtitled original language film is hard. So everything about 24 is also in 25. So we could say that dubbed films are found much more easily, right? It is much easier to find a dubbed film in Italy than it is to find a subtitled film. Now, if you were worried that was a too extreme distractor or something like that, it literally says it's much more easily to find. So if you missed this, I think you did one of two things. Either you flip-flopped which was which, right? You thought that this was asking about um, subtitled rather than dubbed films, or you're moving too quick, or finally you were worried that answer choice A was a too extreme distractor when it definitely wasn't. Okay, so 26 asks, the passage indicates that a foreign film with which of the following characteristics is particularly difficult to dub. So let's go to the passage where it talks about this. It says that there are certain foreign films which were considered to be undubbable, such as French box office hit, which relies on linguistic misunderstandings for much of its comedy, right? So it looks like linguistic misunderstandings are an example of a um, foreign film that is hard to dub, right? So we're looking for an answer choice that says linguistic misunderstandings creates its comedy. What does that? Answer choice A, to the word, right? So the hard part about 26 is figuring out where do we talk about films that are hard to be dubbable? This undubbable is that. Okay, so that is where 26 is located. If you missed this question, I would assume that you just didn't find this portion of the text that directly relates to the question in 26. All right. Okay, 27 is what we call a detail question. We are asked to look directly in the passage to see how Vairano differs from other Italian directors of dubbing. So, what does it say? Vairano has been one of the few directors to break the habit of matching the same Italian dubber to a foreign actor for all his films. Instead, he selects the dubber according to the requirements of the specific role. So instead of doing like we see later, we have Luca Ward doing all of Samuel L. Jackson, and we have someone else who's doing all of Meg Ryan. Vairano takes a different approach and mixes and matches depending on the role. So that is not what most people do, okay? So the correct answer is going to be B, right? Because he does not always match the same Italian dubber to the same foreign actor like other people. That's exactly what we see in the passage. Remember, 27 is a detail question, so finding that detail directly verbatim from the passage is going to be best. And with that, we have ended our third passage, and we'll move on to the fourth one, our final passage from this ACT 498's reading. Okay, so now we are talking about passage 4, which is broadly about the topic of steel. So basically, the main thing you'll want to keep straight while you are navigating this passage as a whole is that we don't want to get bogged down in the specificities. We want to understand this as a general overview. Okay, so um, cast iron was the initial metal of the Industrial Revolution. But once Bessemer developed the process for making steel, all of a sudden we have kind of this new jubilation. And Bessemer himself is lauded not just as an engineer, but as a scientist. Okay, now, um, what is steel? Ultimately, it is the amount of carbon that's mixed in with iron to make steel. Bessemer wasn't working alone, or like totally on his own. He looked at some of the notions of Bergman, uh, a scientist that did this. Okay, so notice that there's kind of a undertone of saying, aren't people who work with steel scientists as well. Um, and in fact, this Bergman guy was the mentor of the chemist who discovered oxygen. Okay, so being a metallurgist doesn't mean you are only in that. So, turns out this notion of oxygen becomes really important for the transition from pig iron to steel. Why? Air removes carbon in the form of this, right? So pig iron contains 4% carbon, whereas steel has only 0.3% to 2%. So using oxygen to remove carbon from pig iron is what makes steel. But now we talk a little bit more about science, right? Uh, a spice of other elements is helpful to turn iron into steel, right? Manganese makes it harder, or stronger, excuse me. Nickel improves its hardness. Chromium improves its rust resistance, right? Modern steels are alloys blended to give the best desired properties. And here we see a really interesting point in the next paragraph, which is that uh, so some of this is science, right? This is kind of the overall question overall in this passage. Is this science? And yes and no, right? I mean, of course, it does have a sort of trial and error explanation, but this is a aspect of science, right? Trial and error empiricism is difficult, right? It is one of our most ancient arts, but one of the youngest sciences, meaning it has to be trial and error in the past, but now it gets to be a little bit less so. Uh, Finally, we get into this last portion, which really talks about um, the scale of steel. Um, so getting into these micrometers or millimeters in size is a huge deal, right? And the hardest of sciences are metallurgy and the social sciences. Okay, so we get kind of a cross reference here. And then finally, uh, we have a final paragraph that sort of talks at length about what defines the mechanical properties. It's ultimately their flaws, right? How flaws interact. Okay. Um, so modifying dislocations is what helps determine the structure of metals. So overall, this passage is basically about steel, but then talks about metallurgy overall, metallurgy as a science, metallurgy as a craft, as an art form, and how all of these things interact. So that's the passage as a whole. Okay, so question 28 is a main idea, main purpose question. We're asked about the passage as a whole. Okay, so all of the wrong answers here are ultimately ones that get too fixated on the details or are too broad overall. Okay, um, so basically, philosophical questions concerning metallurgy. Okay, what does a philosophical question mean? That doesn't mean just sort of like, pondering something. That means we have to actually be doing a philosophical inquiry, right? Are we talking about anything philosophical here specifically? No, right? We do talk about metallurgy as a whole, but not that. If you missed this question 28, I'd suggest you watch the passage overview video we just uh, the video immediately before this one, in which I go over the passage entirely. Okay. A is wrong because it's rather than C being too broad, A is too detailed, right? The Bessemer experiments are part of this, but is that the main focus? No, right? That's just a detail that reveals the main purpose, right? So both A and C kind of happen in the passage to some degree, but C goes too broad, A goes too detailed. D, again, We do talk a little bit about the differences between pig iron and cast iron, perhaps. But is that detail revealing of the main purpose? No. So the main idea is ultimately we're talking about scientific principles in general that apply to the creation and behavior of steel. So we're focusing specifically on steel, um, on metal. So as we go through that, we see that being kind of what exactly makes sense for us. So B is correct, right? Because we talk about scientific principles overall, specifically focusing on steel and how steel reveals certain things about the science of metals. 29 is what we call a detail question. So it asks, actually, it uses the word for one of the only times we'll see it says details. So where do we hear about the initial response to Bessemer's new steelmaking process? Okay. The initial response was greeted with jubilation. The details meant he was lauded as an engineer, as a scientist, and elected a fellow of the Royal Society. Right? So jubilation, if you don't know what that word means unfathomable excitement. So it was a significant achievement. It was published in the Times. People applauded him. They lauded him. He was really famous and important. All right. Do we have a notion that this was prone to failure? No. Are these his qualifications as an engineer? No. Nor does that have anything to do with the response. And finally, do we see criticism here? No. So make sure you're going based off the passage here, but we don't want to fall for a recycled language distractor like C, where engineer, the word just makes us think that that must be correct. So A for 29. So for 30, we want to go to the text that specifically talks about this portion, the information that Bergman was a mentor and sponsor of Scheele. So where do we see that? That is this paragraph here. Okay, we get Bergman here being a sponsor of Scheele. So we are trying to show he was by any standards a scientist, right? That's the goal of the author here. So we show that he made an extensive study of all of these things and even was a mentor and sponsor of the discoverer of oxygen, right? So if you missed this question, I'd suggest you go back a few videos to watch the passage overview, where I talk about the goal, one of the goals of the passage, which is to show how science equals you know some of this mentorship and science is also a part of metallurgy. So we're trying to show that he is indeed a scientist because he was not just an engineer, he was not just a metallurgist, he was a chemist and many other things and a teacher as such, right? So um, that's how we get to D. Uh, Scientific communities as a notion that seems too specific. Uh, More successful scientists than Scheele. Discovering oxygen is probably a big deal, nor is there really a comparison. And then finally, a teacher as well as a scientist. That isn't the goal here. We're not trying to show that Bergman is a teacher. We're trying to show that these metallurgists are scientists as well. So in context, we can see that it's D for 30. 31, we're asked about a word in context. Now, we're not actually asked the definition of this word, but rather what this word does. So we look at line 37, or in your case, it'll be highlighted, and we see it says a spice, sorry, not line 37, a different line, a spice of other elements, right? So putting in other elements will do these things. So then we see in the context of the paragraph as a whole, all of these ways in which additives can improve steel's qualities, whether it be chromium that makes it rust resistant, hardness improved by nickel, manganese making it stronger, etc. Right? So a spice of elements means that we are showing that certain elements can enrich steel's quality, right? That's its context, which is important here. That's what it means. Okay. Are they actually used sparingly? No. Blending elements was a trial and error exploration at first, but not anymore. Okay, sorry, I'm using red for wrong. So that's wrong. That's wrong. And then this gradually mixing isn't declared anywhere either. We don't know if these things are gradually mixed. So that's why we have to B for question 31. So 32 says, based on the passage, which of the following statements would the author most likely agree? All right, so C is directly attested to in the passage, right? Here we say, um, it is one of our most ancient arts, but also one of our youngest sciences. This is something that the author sees as a remarkable claim from a remarkable physicist, right? Now, we see that it is not that the science is trivial, but that it is difficult. It also, though, has an air of an artisan craft, right? So we have these first couple paragraphs really is showing, metallurgy is something of a science. Then we have paragraphs saying it's also kind of artisanal, like an art. And then we see this great quote, it is one of our most ancient arts, but one of our youngest sciences. Okay, so D is a recycled language distractor, but it is in fact not a trivial science. B, it is very difficult, but it's not too difficult to be considered a science. And then finally, A, it is a science. It does require scientific knowledge, but that doesn't make it not an art, right? It is both an art and a science. So that's how we arrive to C for question 32. All right, so question 33 is asking a question that has to do with suggestion, but is ultimately some sort of inference, but detail question as well, right? So, the behavior of materials and the study of social sciences is discussed where? It's discussed in this paragraph here, right? The next to last paragraph. So, understanding the behavior has to do with the wide range of length scales, everything from an individual atom to millimeter grains. Okay. So, science is difficult when you have a span of such scales. An example of such a similar thing is in the social sciences, where it's hard to understand the difference between, how we interact as individuals and how we interact as society as a whole. So, um, what makes this true then? It would be A, right? We have to go through a wide range of scales in order to make sense of this whole thing, which is pretty tricky, right? Going from the smallestness of an atom all the way to a millimeter, or from an individual, which is also called atomized in social sciences, to society as a whole. Okay, so that's what we see in that paragraph. Make sure you find that paragraph and hopefully you were annotating this for structure in order to do so. So question 34 is a main idea question. We're asked about the main idea of the last paragraph. The correct answer being A. I think you may have thought I needed to avoid this because of this word defects, right? Defects determine the metal's mechanical properties. Remember, in this case, the defects isn't referring to like things we don't want, but rather is just referring to ways in which um, there are imperfections, right? They are inevitable, right? Inevitable in the regular stacking of atoms in a crystalline material, right? They bend because of dislocations. But if they are too dislocated, if they are too entangled, that's when we get a brittleness. So, um, uh, dislocations can make, certain properties that we want, or can have certain negative properties or impacts, but either way, defects are what determine the properties. Okay. Um, now, are dislocations the most common type? I'm not quite so sure if we want to say that they are the most common type, right? Though we see this here. It says that for sure. But why don't we want to say this? Because is this the main idea here? Is the only thing that this paragraph 34 discusses dislocations? No, that's too specific, right? Um, now, uh, C is wrong because we're only talking about increasing the size of the metal's grains. Okay. since we're only focusing on creasing, that's too specific. And then finally, D, while this is true, is this the main idea? No. So the biggest thing with 34 to focus on is that all of these sort of recycled language distractors are, in the passage, but they don't actually directly refer to what we need in the passage. So that's why they're wrong. So for 35, we're going to underline the word that will be highlighted for you, stretched. So when we go up and we find stretched here, we're not talking about the stretching of materials anymore. We're not talking about the stretching of metals. Rather, we are talking about how how this person's expertise is very expansive. So we want an answer choice that shows that expansiveness, extended, right? Strained, exaggerated, or amplified, these all are ways that stretched may have been able to be used talking about metals. But remember, we got to just find its context within the context, right? And specifically, we're actually not talking about metals anymore. We're talking about this physicist's expertise. So that's going to be that she goes a long way. It extends a lot of distance. C. All right, so for 36, according to the passage, we are asked reducing the size of a metal's grain can make the metal do something. All right, so where do we see the notion of reduction in the size of a metal's grain? So we see that we talk about it over here, right? So metal can be made harder by reducing the size of their grains. All right, so it's directly referred to there. That is why we want to choose answer choice D. Remember, this is a detail question. The answer choice is always going to be directly in the passage. So just go and find it. And we see that that is where we get D, that last part of the passage as a whole. And with that, we are at the end of the reading section. Thank you for joining us to go through this reading section. Every other section also has a video, so feel free to go ahead and watch those. Hope that this was helpful for you, and thank you for joining us.